You're basing your retirement plan on this? What? So I'm reading. All right, first and foremost, my shirt's inside out. Haven't washed, haven't shaved, haven't showered, haven't done anything. Haven't brushed my teeth. All right, so if you don't like the way I look, get on out of here. I don't care. This information is too important to look how I look or my shirt's on inside out. This is insane. Information is the key. Visual effects are not. Don't look at freaking thumbnails with some hot chick and say, oh, I'm going to look at her if she's giving you bad information. The information is the key. Information, not visual stimulation. I can't believe how many people get upset because my shirt's on inside out. Crazy. All right. Anyway, right here. I cannot believe that this is. I am stunned that I cannot be the only one that sits there and said this is nuts that we're using this as our methodology of inflation and using it to determine whether or not we can retire. This is this is incredible to me. It's incredible. So we're going to measuring price change in the CPI, rent and rental equivalents. All right, this is straight from the BLS. And look, I love the BLS. I love the work they do. I don't blame the BLS. I mean, there's no animosity at all. I'm so my mind's boggled that someone says this is weird. If not actually just, it's not nefarious. It's just weird. All right. The index for shelter, the service that a housing unit provides its occupants. You hear what I'm saying here? The index for shelter, the service that a housing unit provides its occupants, is one of the largest parts of the CPI market basket. And it's actually the largest by far. Nothing comes close. Not one of the largest by far. All right, owner's equivalent rent of residences, OER, and rent of primary residence, rent, measure the majority of the change in the shelter cost. All right, all three of these series are published each month. So remember, housing is by far and away the number one contingent of CPI. Shelter is the vast majority of housing, and shelter consists of rent and owner's equivalent rent. All right, as we just talked about. All right, which measures the majority of the shelter costs. The CPI for shelter also includes the CPI for shelter, which again is a huge component. Do I have it on here? I think it's like shelter is 33% of CPI-U. 33%. All right, so let's keep going here. So the CPI for shelter also includes lodging away from home and tenants and household insurance. Okay, so I get that. And lodging away from home, if you go on a trip, something like that, you got to stay at the freaking Bates Motel. All right, so again, part of shelter includes lodging away from home, which is only 0.9% of total CPI. And then tenants and household insurance is only 0.38. So those are small potatoes. We're talking the big potatoes here: rent and owner equivalent rent. Owner equivalent rent of residences. All right. The shelter service that a housing unit provides to its occupants is a relevant consumption item for the CPI. Most of the cost of shelter for renter-occupied housing is rent. That makes sense. For an owner-occupied unit, most of the cost of shelter is the implicit rent that owner occupants would have to pay if they were renting their homes. Owned housing units themselves are not priced in the CPI household survey. So you own your house. That has no effect in terms of whether or not the price has gone up in value. That has nothing to do with CPI. Owning your home is not part of CPI, and it shouldn't be, because the house goes up, there's no cash flow consequence of you owning your home and the price goes up or down. Hope that makes sense, because we're talking about cash flow consumption. Let's see. Like most other nations' economic statistics programs, the CPI views owned housing units as capital goods, distinct from the shelter service they provide, and therefore not as consumption goods, which is one of the things that ticks me off about transportation costs in the CPI. They're looking at the cost of buying a new or used vehicle as a consumption good when it is a capital good. It doesn't make sense. I haven't bought a new or used vehicle in 5 years. Why would that be part of my CPI? It's a capital good, not a consumption good. Consumption good are food, electricity, all that stuff. Anyway, let's keep going here. Spending to purchase and improve houses and other housing units is treated as an investment and not as a consumption for CPI. Okay, that's 100%. I like that. That's the way it should be. It makes complete sense, as should be in transportation. Spending to buy a new car, sell a car should not be part of the CPI, which talks about consumption increases your cost of living on a monthly to month basis. All right. So the expenditure weight in the CPI for the market basket of owner's equivalent rent is based on the following question of the Consumer Expenditure Survey. When they ask of people who own their primary residence. All right, so remember, owner's equivalent rent is 24% of the entirety of CPI. A quarter is in this one question of your cost of living increase or decreases. On top of that, you still have rent of primary residence on top of that. It's kind of like I say with long-term care. Most people, if they need long-term care in terms of assisted living facilities, skilled care or something like that, they sell their house. Why? Because you cannot simultaneously, it's impossible, regardless of what Richard Dawkins says and Stephen Hawking and all these clowns and the physicists, you cannot simultaneously occupy your home and assisted living facility at the same time. It's impossible. So that means one of those two things will be unoccupied. Usually it's going to be your house, which means you sell it and you move into an assisted living facility. It's the same thing. The same thing. That's why I say to people like, look, we have long-term care insurance baked into the system if you have your house. It's called selling the primary residence. Now, do I want you to have to do that? No. But that usually is what happens. And same thing here. We have rent of primary residence, which consists of about 7.5% of total CPI. And then we have owner's equivalent rent of residence, which consists of about 25%. So 33% of the entirety of CPI is in shelter. But both you can't mutually exclude. These are mutually exclusive. You can't simultaneously rent a house and then owner equivalent rent. That doesn't make sense. You can't do both. Anyway, so check this out. Here's the question. This is I fundamentally I can't believe this. Again, the question that we ask homeowners is so we can figure out how much of CPI is adjusted for this biggest thing in inflation. This is the biggest component of inflation right here. If someone were to rent your home today, how much do you think it would rent for monthly, unfinished, and without utilities? That is 24% of CPI, of inflation. They're going to ask me, Josh, if someone were to rent your house today, how much do you think it would rent for without utilities or household furnishings? Let's just say it's at $2,500 a month. Okay, thank you, sir. That's it. And we're going to use that as a component, the biggest component of inflation. But no cash is changing hands. I'm not receiving that $2,500. No, we're going to consider that owner's equivalent rent, that if you were to rent, that's what you would pay. But I'm not. But if you were. But I'm not. I mean, this doesn't make sense. No cash is coming into me. No cash is going out. It makes no sense for that. And I know what you're saying. You say, what about mortgages? Well, mortgage is a different component because mortgage, if it's fixed, has no inflation component to it whatsoever. Even if its mortgage isn't fixed, the inflation component has anything to do with CPI. It has to do with the fact that you're paying whatever the cost of whatever the interest rates are. So why would this be considered as part of CPI? How much I could get from my rent? That makes no sense. Now, let me pause real quick. I got to take a drink. So in economics, we'd call this implicit income. All right. So how much are you receiving in rent? Nothing. Exactly. We call that implicit. So you're not receiving any income, but that on what I say is when you actually own a house is how much do you not have to earn as an income to pay your mortgage. That's implicit income. So if let's say your mortgage is $2,500, that means it costs you $30,000 a year for your mortgage, right? Right. Everybody gets that. If I have no mortgage, inherently that means there's $30,000 of income I do not need to make in which to pay the mortgage, which also means there's $30,000 of income I don't have to pay tax on. So that's implicit income. By having your home free and clear of the mortgage man, you have income that you no longer need to make, implicit income, because you're living rent free in your own house. And that's kind of what CPI is trying to do. Essentially, they're saying implicit income. How much rent would you get on your home? Okay, but why that would be factored in and consumption increases year over year makes no sense at all, because I'm not getting it. So they're trying to use implicit income as part of the is literally the number one factor in CPI. It doesn't make any sense. It's implicit. It's not happening. There's no income there. It's crazy. All right. All right. Let's see. The census provides. I'm just going to read this right quick. The sample design of the housing survey is fairly complex, but essentially housing units are selected in proportion to the share of total spending on shelter. You hear that? The housing units are selected in proportion to their share of total spending on shelter. But they're not spending, my mortgage is what I spend on shelter, which isn't part of, it's not part of this. It's not part of this. What's part of CPI, again, is how much I could get if I were to rent my home today. And so they're going to say, well, if you could get $2,500 and your nominal income is $60,000, that means 50% of your expenditures go to housing. But we know that's not true. Say I could get $30,000 from my rent. My nominal income is $100,000. That means 30% of my expenditures go to housing, but shelter. But that's literally not true. And we're going to use that 30% to adjust for inflation. And we're going to say this year I could have got $2,500. Next year I could get $2,600. Thus inflation went up by whatever that is, $100 per 25. I don't know what it is, 1%, something like that. But it makes no sense because that didn't happen. It's insanity. Total spending on shelter includes the total spending on rent and own housing units. Using data from the Census Bureau, essentially, the CPI program defines segments are one or more census blocks. The census provides the number of renter and owner using houses in each segment and the average rent of the renters in each segment. By the way, 2/3 of the the rent of what they use in terms of housing versus rent goes to homeowners. So 2/3 are homeowners in terms of CPI. 2/3 are based. Is the owner equivalent rent. How much could you get in rent? For 2/3 of the sample size of the consumer expenditure survey, for which all this is based on. It's nonsense. Because 2/3 of people aren't receiving that. It's crazy. The missing piece not available from the census is the average owner cost for the owners in this segment. Average owner cost, right, because there is no average owner cost. BLS estimates this average implicit rent of the owner units in this segment by modeling consumer expenditure survey renter equivalent values and applying those parameter estimates to each sample segment, enabling the CPI to calculate the total spending, rent versus implicit rent for each payment. The CPI collects rent data from each sample every 6 months. They calculate the measure of a price change for each They calculate the measure of the price change for each CPI index for the rent and OER indexes. Anything else I want to talk about? No. And then they got this insane calculation. So obviously they have never learned that simplicity is divine here. And look, this is not to bash BLS, not to bash inflation. I'm going to show you a better way. All right, because basically what I'm looking at and when I'm doing my research isn't, I hate to say it, but the renter isn't my priority. It's just not. The owner, because the owners, most Americans, frankly, most middle-class Americans own their homes. And most middle-class Americans are basing their retirement plan on the CPI, which has nothing to do with their cash flow. Nothing at all. And I'm afraid to say, most middle-class Americans are probably afraid to retire because their expenses can't keep up with inflation. Inflation is what exactly? CPI. Well, I just showed you. CPI is completely irrelevant to you. It is. Now, there are things that are relevant. Food, healthcare, electricity, and that's what I'm going to talk about in my book that I'm writing. But this is freaking nuts. All right, love your thoughts. We'll see you.